Okay. Έγινε. Ναι.
Κύριε Κουλαουζίδη, η κυρία Καλογιαννάκη ήθελε να μας μιλήσει λίγο για την
Όχι τώρα.
βιογραφία της. Εδώ είναι.
Ωραία. Είμαστε και online και
Έλα, πέλα μου.
αν θέλετε, κλείστε τα μικρόφωνά σας προς το παρόν για να μπορέσουμε να ξεκινήσουμε. Antonia, welcome first of all, and thank you for being with us today. It's very kind of you to accept this invitation and be with us early. It's very early in Los Angeles right now, so I understand. We have a lot of people from Greece and one person from Thailand actually following you right now. And we also have about 20 to 25 people that are watching us from YouTube. So I will speak Greek for a while, and then I will let you know when you will, let's say, take the floor. Κυρίες και κύριοι, χαίρομαι, αγαπητές φίλες και φίλοι, χαίρομαι που είστε μαζί μας σήμερα σε αυτή την πρώτη εκδήλωση που κάνει το εργαστήριο της βιογραφικής έρευνας και μετασχηματιστικής μάθησης στο Ελληνικό Ανοιχτό Πανεπιστήμιο, το οποίο διευθύνει ο κύριος Παλιός, που είναι επίσης μαζί μας. Σήμερα έχουμε την τιμή να είναι μαζί μας η καθηγήτρια Αντωνία Darder, που θεωρείται ειδική, μία από τις πιο ειδικούς επιστημόνισσες, θα έλεγα, μια από τις πιο ειδικές επιστημόνισσες στην θεωρία και την πράξη του Paulo Freire. Το πρόγραμμα θα είναι ως εξής. Θα κάνω εγώ μια μικρή παρουσίαση τώρα της Αντωνία Darder. Αμέσως μετά θα δώσω το λόγο στην καθηγήτρια Darder, που θα σας μιλήσει. Θα δείξουμε ένα μικρό βίντεο μετά και όχι ένα βιντεάκι, όπως λέμε συνήθως. Δεν μου αρέσει η λέξη βιντεάκι. Για όσους είστε πιο κοντινοί μου, ξέρετε ότι δεν μου αρέσει καθόλου αυτή η λέξη. Ένα μικρό βίντεο λοιπόν που έχει να κάνει με το έργο του Freire. Και μετά προφανώς θα μπορέσουμε να συζητήσουμε είτε μέσω του chat, είτε αν είμαστε μικρή ομάδα, θα σηκώσετε χέρι και θα μιλήσετε. Βλέπω και το φίλο μου τον Βαγγέλη τον Κουμανάκο, που είναι ο καθηγητής στο ΕΑΠ και διευθυντής του Κέντρου Διδασκαλίας και Μάθησης του ΕΑΠ. Βαγγέλη, σε ευχαριστώ.
Πολλά συγχαρητήρια. Πολλά συγχαρητήρια για την εκδήλωση.
Τώρα βλέπω και πολλούς φίλες και φίλους, να μην τους πω όλους ονομαστικά, γιατί θα πάρει πολλή ώρα. Ξεκινάω λοιπόν πολύ γρήγορα να σας δείξω λίγο, να σας πω, να κάνω μια σύντομη εισαγωγή για την καθηγήτρια Darder. Είναι στα ελληνικά η εισαγωγή αυτή. Η Αντωνία Darder κατάγεται από το Πουέρτο Ρίκο, και αυτή τη στιγμή είναι καθηγήτρια ηθικής και ηθικής ηγεσίας σε ένα πολύ καλό πανεπιστήμιο στην Καλιφόρνια, στο Πανεπιστήμιο Loyola Marymount, ενώ επίσης είναι και επίτιμη καθηγήτρια εκπαιδευτικής πολιτικής και οργάνωσης στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Ιλινόι. Η Αντωνία μετανάστευσε με τη μητέρα της σε ηλικία 3 ετών, μια εποχή που μετά τον Δεύτερο Παγκόσμιο Πόλεμο, όταν περίπου 500.000, μισό εκατομμύριο περίπου Πορτορικάνοι μετανάστευσαν στην Αμερική και μεγάλωσε σε πραγματικά συνθήκες ακραίας φτώχειας στο ανατολικό Λος Άντζελες, που είναι μια περιοχή που ζουν συνήθως μετανάστες. Ξεκίνησε τις σπουδές της και μάλιστα ήταν μητέρα 3 παιδιών όταν ξεκίνησε τις σπουδές της στο κοινοτικό κολέγιο στην Πασαντίνα και αρχικά σπούδασε νοσηλευτική και εργάστηκε στην αρχή λοιπόν ως νοσηλεύτρια σε μια παιδιατρική κλινική, όπου μεταξύ άλλων είχε την ευθύνη για προγράμματα αγωγής υγείας για γονείς. Στη συνέχεια φοιτήσε στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Καλιφόρνια, το Πολιτιακό Πανεπιστήμιο της Καλιφόρνιας. Αυτό έχει σημασία, είναι και επίκαιρη η συζήτηση για τα μη κρατικά πανεπιστήμια και όλα αυτά. Αυτό είναι ένα κρατικό πανεπιστήμιο λοιπόν στο Λος Άντζελες. Απέκτησε πτυχίο συμβουλευτικής. Συνέχισε με μεταπτυχιακό τίτλο πάλι στη συμβουλευτική και με ειδίκευση στο γάμο, στην οικογένεια και τα παιδιά. Και μετά απέκτησε διδακτορικό τίτλο στην εκπαίδευση από το Claremont Graduate University. Πολύ σημαντικό είναι ότι αργότερα, τα τέλη της δεκαετίας του 80 και αρχές της δεκαετίας του 90, η Αντωνία Darder συνεργάστηκε στενά και μελέτησε από πολύ κοντά το έργο του μεγάλου Βραζιλιάνου εκπαιδευτικού Paulo Freire, οι ιδέες του οποίου επηρέασαν καταλυτικά την κατεύθυνση όλου του έργου της από το σημείο αυτό και μέχρι τις μέρες μας. Έχει πολύ πλούσιο επιστημονικό και συγγραφικό έργο, δεν θα μπορούσα να το χωρέσω σε μια διαφάνεια μόνο. Απλά σας δείχνω μερικά από τα χαρακτηριστικά βιβλία που έχει γράψει. Τα 4 στα αριστερά που βλέπουμε είναι βιβλία που αφορούν την κριτική εκπαίδευση, αλλά και την έρευνα, αν θέλετε. Βλέπετε και 2 βιβλία που είναι αφιερωμένα στο Φρέιρε, και αυτό που είναι στα δεξιά μας είναι το τελευταίο βιβλίο, που είναι ένας, θα λέγαμε, οδηγός μελέτης του κλασικού βιβλίου του Paulo Freire, του Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Εκτός από εκπαιδευτικός και συγγραφέας και ερευνήτρια και τα λοιπά, η Antonia Darder είναι ακτιβίστρια, συμμετέχει ενεργά στους πολιτικούς αγώνες στην Καλιφόρνια και σε άλλα μέρη του κόσμου, είναι ποιήτρια, τραγουδοποιός, αλλά και εικαστικός. Βλέπετε 2 έργα της που έχω επιλέξει να σας δείξω, και γενικότερα στα έργα της αποτυπώνονται οι ιδέες της για την κοινωνική δικαιοσύνη, τους κοινωνικούς αγώνες, την ελευθερία και βέβαια την αγάπη. Ένας όρος που είναι κεντρικός και στο έργο του Φρέιρε. Είναι για μένα, και από όσο γνωρίζω δηλαδή και όσο έχω διαβάσει, είναι ίσως η σημαντικότερη αυτή τη στιγμή ερευνήτρια, εκπαιδευτικός και συγγραφέας της κριτικής εκπαίδευσης ενηλίκων, και μία από τις καλύτερες γνώστριες της φιλοσοφίας που πρέσβευε ο Πάολο Φρέιρε. Την καλωσορίζουμε θερμά λοιπόν στο Ελληνικό Ανοιχτό Πανεπιστήμιο, και ξεκινάω τα αγγλικά. Dear Antonia, welcome, a big welcome from the community of the Hellenic Open University, and thank you for accepting our invitation, and I'm stopping the presentation and the floor is yours.
Okay, γεια σου. Thank you, George. Ευχαριστώ. A pleasure, absolute pleasure to be with you, and I'm grateful for those who have come, and I hope that we have a good time, and find this to be a valuable moment together. So that's my intention that I put out to you in this moment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give a few comments related to kind of to contextualize and just a bit of the Freire's intellectual history and a few words about some of the critiques and things like that. And then I'll stop for a minute in case anyone has questions or wants a clarification. And then I will go chapter by chapter of Pedagogy of the Oppressed and give you my reading of the book. And in each situation, I will stop at the end of each kind of summary of the chapter and then open it up just in case there's questions at that point. And that way we can have a bit of interactive, but if you want to wait until the end, that's okay too. But we will make that available, that opportunity for intervention if you'd like. Okay, so I'm going to just go ahead and get started. One thing that George explained to me is that there are folks who. Oh, I'm sorry. One moment. A technical difficulty here.
Ωραία. Θα το λύσουμε και αυτό.
That some of you know English very well, and others may know English somewhat well, different levels. So I tend to speak very fast, so I will try to make a concerted effort to just bring my pace a little down. But forgive me if I go too quickly. I think what happens, there's a lot I want to share with you, and so I get very excited and passionate, and then that kind of makes things move quicker. So let me get started. In 1995, about 2 years before Paulo died, he wrote in Pedagogy of Hope, I believe, or rather I'm convinced, that we have never needed radical positions in the sense of the radicalness that I advocate in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, as we need them today.
I can't find my keys.
I'm getting feedback. Is there somebody, if people can unmute, I mean, no, you can mute.
I'm cold all the time.
I'm sorry. All right, let me continue. So the dehumanizing impact of capitalism and its sordid inequalities is at work in the lives of students worldwide today, just as they were for students in Freire's time. So conditions tied to global economic apartheid must then be recognized as part of a deeper structural and epistemic political project that shapes the conditions of people's lives, both domestically and internationally. And these were concerns that Freire had even then. As such, what happens locally within schools and communities is always linked to international structural forces that are related to labor and the marketplace. These are completely inextricably linked and not inseparable. Forces that are generally obscured by the mythical rhetoric of modernity. And despite the many social and technological advances that have transpired in the last century, humanity still remains deeply divided between the haves and the have-nots. The majority of the world's countries are governed by the law of profit and greed, which normalizes the economic precarity created by the financial anarchy of the wealthy and the powerful. Hence, the logic of modernity bolsters sweeping controls over the internationalization of capital, as well as narrowly defines the culture of knowledge production, which sustains a concentration of power and wealth among a very small percentage of the world's population. According to a report by Oxfam, there are 8 men in the world who own more wealth than 3.6 billion people. That's half of the world's population. The collective wealth of the world's 5 richest men more than doubled between 2020 and the end of 2023, ballooning from an already staggering $405 billion to $869 billion. That's the wealth that is held in the hands of 5 men. The richest 1% own more than twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion people. Meanwhile, increasing world poverty continues to take a devastating toll on the lives of more than 600 million people who live in extreme poverty. Within the United States, we show that the top 10% of the population owns 93% of the wealth. Moreover, conservative estimates state that almost 40 million people in the United States live in poverty. 1 child out of every 6. So there's this growing economic inequality and this toxic combination of tax breaks for the rich, unemployment, unstable employment, increasing indebtedness, and devastating cuts to the social safety net belie any notions of equity or inclusivity or diversity that is often the rhetoric of many educational institutions, not only in the United States, but around the world where I've traveled. With this in mind, then, it's imperative that we confront the greed, the lovelessness, and immorality of those who perpetuate economic apartheid by countering common sense myths that the poor will always be with us, or that the poor are poor because of their own doing, or that subaltern populations are culturally, intellectually deficient and thus require being fixed or helped, or that we are all on some kind of a level playing field, so all we have to do is pull ourselves up from the bootstraps. These are issues that in many ways Paulo was trying to deal with in his work. It is astounding that so many who live in the global north seem conveniently unaware that most of their comforts and their freedoms and rights have and continue to be built on the backs of oppressed populations. As such, they remain unaware of the ways in which projected myths of scarcity perpetuate commonsensical beliefs that there are not enough resources for all, and that having more is better, and that the current state of massive global inequality is simply the result of the survival of the fittest. Such deceptive myths conveniently then justify modernity's rationale for perpetual accumulation in the name of progress, obscuring conditions of oppression and deflecting responsibility away from those who are actually responsible for global poverty and human suffering in the first place. The construction and imposition of false myths and deficit views reinforce what Paulo Freire termed cultural invasion. a social instrument of domination that arises out of a deliberate and planned intention to forge social, political, and economic control. When people say to me that somehow Freire is out of, is out of date or doesn't have any relevance today, it's part of the reason why I offer that bit of introduction, that in fact, his notion of cultural invasion very much spoke to this question of domination that continues to plague us around the world. In response, revolutionary educators have worked and continue to work to embrace Paulo's dream for a more just and loving world. This is made apparent in that next to John Dewey, Paulo Freire is the second most cited educational philosopher in the world. Despite his renown, in Paulo's own beloved Brazil, the country's former right-wing reactionary government, led by Jair Bolsonaro, sought to rid all references to Freire, as well as LGBTQ and feminist theory in 2021, which is only a couple of years ago. In the face of the political arrogance and neoliberal logic of greed that informs such attacks, educators worldwide gathered that same year in a variety of virtual forums to celebrate and commemorate Paulo Freire's 100th birthday and to illustrate that despite efforts to extinguish his legacy, Paulo's ideas continue to flourish through innovative readings of his writings and reinventions of his ideas. In considering Paulo Freire's history and contributions, it's useful to acknowledge him as an early epistemologist of the South. This to say, his epistemological sensibilities emerged directly from his contestation of what Quijano calls the coloniality of power. Freire was concerned with the moral disregard for the casualties that capitalism leaves behind, despite the widespread presence of government and church institutions in Latin America and other parts of the world that often turn a deaf ear and blind eye to human suffering by perpetuating myths about subaltern populations. For example, the poor will somehow always be with us. I've heard this from people in churches, and I think these are the kind of commonsensical mantras that actually keep us stuck and keep oppression alive. In 1963, Paulo launched the Barefoot Feet Can Also Learn to Read campaign in the state of Rio Grande do Norte, where 300 sugarcane workers in the interior village of Anhicos were taught to read and write in 45 days. It is estimated that under Freire's direction, 20,000 cultural circles were programmed to be set up for 2 million illiterate individuals. However, at the time, Brazil as a nation was heavily embroiled in a contentious politics tied historically to its damaging legacy of Portuguese colonialism and its own complex internal politics, which resulted in the 1964 military overthrow of President João Belchior Goulart and bringing an end to the literacy campaign and Paulo's exile from Brazil. Freire's epistemological interventions then are in sync with the anti-colonial preoccupations of Latin American philosophers on the left, as well as revolutionary writers such as Franz Fanon, Albert Memmi, Aimé Césaire, Julius Nyerere, and Amílcar Cabral. In an unapologetic acknowledgement of the brutality of human oppression, Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed sought to intentionally shift the focus away from a dehumanizing and debilitating epistemology of knowledge construction toward a liberating and humanizing one. As such, Freire's approach was imbued with a decolonizing sensibility that directly connected material conditions of oppression to the brutal forces of cultural invasion imposed on the oppressed in Brazil and around the world. Beyond these influences, Freire read widely theological, philosophical, historical texts, along with revolutionary literature on the left, whose influences are noted throughout the pages of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So if we look at Freire's intellectual history, what we see is that philosophers in the existential tradition, where there's a major importance put to the notion of existence and ontological concerns. He was reading Kierkegaard, Jaspers, the French existentialist Sartre, de Beauvoir, Dufresne, Mannheim, and Buber. These were important intellectual figures for him. He read in phenomenology. In fact, his degree was in that area. So he was reading Hegel and Husserl and Heidegger, which reinforced the importance of experience in the political process, the actual lived experience. Other revolutionary influences related to social and material inequalities were his readings in Marxism. So Marx and Lenin and Luxemburg and Lukács and Gramsci. He read the work of the Frankfurt School, and he was especially fond of the writings of Fromm. Educational philosophers such as Henry Bergson, who did a lot of work around knowledge and intuition, Dewey's work around democracy and pragmatism, and Peter Furter's work in relationship to andragogical concerns. So he was a person who was constantly reading in these different traditions, trying to bring together elements that would help him to understand what was happening in his own context. With Pedagogy of the Oppressed, then Freire sought to unveil the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, unleash it of its ideological stranglehold, and counter the binary and closed system of Eurocentric modernist rationality and the epistemologies of blindness that it produces. Over the years, various critiques of Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed have been issued about a variety of questions and contradictions in his work. Critics have bemoaned the romanticization of Freire's discourse, the problematics of applying Freire's method, concluding that Freire, rather than being revolutionary, acted as a liberal member of a Catholic intellectual elite. Others called out Freire's use of patriarchal language and his failure to engage questions of gender. And still others judged Pedagogy of the Oppressed to be an illogical and inconsistent text, filled with a contradictory discourse, lacking systematic analysis. I'm going to let you be the judge of that. Obviously, I would not use his work if I felt that that was in fact true. At other times, Freire's ideas have been considered to be harmful, not just to students, but to teachers entrusted with their education. Incidentally, this echoes the political views that not too long in this country, the Tucson Unified School District in the state of Arizona actually banned Pedagogy of the Oppressed, along with some other books that were not to be used in the classroom. And that went on for a couple of years because it took a major campaign to fight against that. Other critics have challenged Freire's speciesism, or this privileging of human life in his articulations of freedom and empowerment. In many instances, Freire actually made intentional efforts to rethink his language and expand his understanding when he was alive. Shifts reflected in his writings over the course of his lifetime. So if you read his work, you begin to see some shifts in his language. But more recently, post-humanist critiques of humanity or humanization, so much a part of Paulo Freire's discourse, argue that these inadvertently reinscribe common sense discourses of supremacy, of patriarchy, and oppression, values that are in direct contradiction to Freire's expressed and lived liberatory intent. So the things that he's been accused of are exactly the things that he was writing against. So there's a way in which we have to think about, what are the motivations behind some of these critiques. Here we can only imagine Freire's response, which more than likely would have been to read and listen carefully to criticisms unfolding, and perhaps offer alternative readings in ways that would welcome deeper reflection and dialogue. Central concerns would have been linked to the concrete political consequences of those critiques, as well as their overarching impact on our thinking, our actions, our politics, and our pedagogy. So the dialogue would have been unquestionably thoughtful, engaging, and very, very passionate. Freire was well aware of critiques and tensions that surrounded his praxis. In the preface of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he openly states that some might see his deeply humanizing ontological position as purely idealistic, while others might refute his denunciation of state oppression. But he also makes it clear that the book is written with radicals in mind. As an emancipatory intellectual in the decolonizing tradition. Freire firmly believed in the relational necessity of engaging conflicts across ontological and epistemological differences, as well as grappling with tensions rooted in the binary formations and constructions of the Western mind. Freire spoke across a variety of philosophical perspectives, advocating an openness to ideas as a democratic imperative for revolutionary scholars from oppressed populations who sought to unravel the impact of the coloniality of power in our lives and in our work. In an examination of his intellectual journey, what stands out clearly is that Freire was not a rigid or dogmatic thinker, in that his early lived experience of surviving and maneuvering extremely difficult conditions of social and economic oppression perhaps prepared him to see the folly of sectarianism. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo denounced sectarianism as an obstacle to our emancipation, in that it mythicizes, alienates, and negates freedom, manufacturing knowledge in the absence of democratic participation. Similarly, he was concerned with political views devoid of dialogue and scholarship that failed to emerge from the concrete social and material conditions of the people and from a spirit of solidarity with them. In fact, Paulo's notes in his preface to Pedagogy of the Oppressed was not that the book was not produced as an abstract project. It evolved rooted in his concrete dialogical experiences and observations with workers and students across classes. Key experiences were his adult literacy work in Brazil before exile, as well as his experiences living in exile in Chile, where he wrote the book. He often credited the Chilean revolutionary comrades for the evolution of his political formation, which shifted the tenor of his political voice after his time in Chile. Paulo believed fiercely in the power of his lived history and its significance in the construction of knowledge and the struggle for our liberation. He often noted how his lived experience in childhood and difficulties in schools influenced the direction of his work. About this, he wrote, "I didn't understand anything because of my hunger. I wasn't dumb. It wasn't lack of interest. My social condition didn't allow me to have an education. Experience showed me, once again, the relationship between social class and knowledge." Paulo's early life among impoverished rural working class people also instilled in him a deep sense of love and compassion for the oppressed and an understanding of how conditions of poverty impact the education of children in oppressed communities. It was here that he learned also about the culture of silence. Paulo's epistemology cannot be understood then through straight line trajectories detached of concrete historical events, economic conditions, personal relationships, pedagogical practices, or philosophical traditions from which he constantly grappled to make sense of human oppression and the role of education as either a force for domination or a force for emancipation. In writing Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo sought to redefine our work as radical educators, besieging us not to become prisoners of a circle of certainty, which in turn imprisons reality. He instead urges us to enter into a revolutionary process, a dialogical communal process where transformative social change is possible. For Freire, to be radical is to nourish the critical spirit and creativity that liberates us and moves us towards greater engagement in an effort to transform our concrete, objective reality in the world. So I'm just going to stop there. That's kind of my intro, and just hoping that you're getting a sense of what I'm trying to bring forth. This sense of how it's not in speaking about Freire. I also want you to know that I'm speaking about us as well. That our own histories, our own intellectual histories, our own how we grew up, the people who surround us, the texts that we read, all of these elements come into play in our scholarship and in our work and in our practice in the very same way as they did for Paulo Freire.
Okay, do you want us to ask questions now, or?
Well, I'm kind of opening it. I'm asking the question. I'm asking you, George. I mean, are there some questions that want to be should be answered right now that you can see?
Well, I can see Pella Kalogiannakis has raised a hand. So Pella, please.
Hi, Pella.
Hello, Antonia. How are you? So nice to see you. Congratulations to the laboratory, to Professor, for explaining to the audience, Antonia and Crete, because I'm from the University of Crete. We have very strong relations, and in the last years we had the opportunity to meet each other here in Crete and speak and dance together. Antonia, in the context of our postgraduate program on critical pedagogy. Antonia, it's a question, a general question, just for, I would like to welcome you also and pose the following thought. Does pedagogy of love in our times, so difficult times of artificial intelligence, of technology, of non-human direct relations, etc. How do you think that this pedagogy of love can help?
Well, I mean, I hope that as I go through each of the chapters with some of the elements that, you know, and aspects that Freire was raising, and that it will become self-evident. I mean, to me, his whole, I mean, understanding of love had to do with connection, with an understanding of the inseparability between all of us, that we have this delusion that somehow we're all separate and we create these barriers and we lose, because in fact it is in the interest of oppression for us to see ourselves as alienated and separate from each other. It is in the interest of oppression to teach students to compete with each other rather than to commune and to be with each other, to work with each other and to learn with each other. So I believe that without love, what we have is this lovelessness. We have this brutal, you know, alienation that comes to be because it creates a culture of separation that silences those who are oppressed, that allows those who are opportunists and those who have power to override without any kind of dialogue or without any kind of participation. So I believe that what happens in a pedagogy of love is that in fact it breaks the culture of silence, in that it realizes that in order for human beings to truly come to learn together, to grow and to evolve and transform, there has to be space made. There has to be room for engagement, for thoughtful engagement. You know, it's not about training people, you're just training them, although that term is used over and over, but yet that's not what we need in the world. What we need is to create the space where where we understand ourselves, where students understand themselves truly as cultural citizens of the world. And they begin to understand that what they do in their own place in the world has an impact, not only in their space or in their city or in their community, it has an impact across the world. And it's very hard for us within an epistemology of the West that categorizes and separates and divides for us to imagine. And it also, think about it, in a pedagogy of love, it changes our sense of responsibility for ourselves, for each other, and our experience and our participation in the world. And I think that that's a huge element that is so important in what we're doing, particularly in terms of graduate programs with teachers who are going to go out and teach children, and often teach in communities that are very oppressed, where children are struggling to learn. Not that they don't want to learn, they're struggling to learn because the conditions are very, very difficult.
Thank
So
you,
I don't know if
Antonia.
that answers.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bella, very much for this
Thank you, Bella.
interesting question. Antonia, just something that came to my mind. There's a all these years that I've studied Freire, and I also met people that know Freire. There were many discussions, even in my classroom at the university, that Freire is too left. You know what I'm saying? He's and as such.
And then you have the people who say he's too right.
Yes, but as such, as being
something.
Yes, as being too left, and because he thought of himself as a Christian Marxist, right? I mean, he said, I am influenced by both those big ideologies.
He's had a spiritual path. I mean, there was a spirit. He believed and he lived with a sense of spirituality. But it was an integral element of who he was.
So do you think that this is, I mean, something? I think that this creates some kind of a fear for Freire's ideas. Is that true? Have you ever encountered such a, you know?
I do. I mean, I think that, and I think it'll become apparent when I go through the chapter by chapters again, because he is calling for transformation. He is calling for a shift, ideological, cultural shift. And if it means a shift of consciousness. Now, we can't believe that the shift of consciousness is not also going to bring a material shift. That's the issue. So people sometimes are happy to be talking about things, but they don't want the material shift that goes along with it. And once they begin to realize is that, oh, if we're going to keep going down that road, then this is going to have to change. The business as usual is not going to be able to continue. Then, at that point, you begin to feel fear, because the fear is losing the privilege that is had, the power that is had when you're talking about a redistribution of power and wealth in the world. I don't.
Okay. Yes. So go ahead with the chapters, and we'll see how it goes. Okay.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. Let me drink just. So I'm going to, as I go through this, each chapter, what I realize is what I found to be the focus. So for example, in chapter 1, Freire's focus is why a pedagogy of the oppressed. He's trying to answer that question. Why do we need a pedagogy of the oppressed? And of course, one of his quotes from that chapter is, without freedom, we cannot exist authentically. So the issue of being able to exist authentically was important for Freire, in contrast to existing alienated and divided, as divided human beings. So in this first chapter, Freire contextualizes then the need for the pedagogy of the oppressed by engaging the historical and social conditions under which the oppressed exists, and juxtaposing the impact of their relationship to the ruling class. Here, Freire begins to carefully lay out the specifics of what he terms the oppressor contradiction, and how he theorizes the possibilities for engaging and transforming this contradiction that's anchored within particular attitudes, relationships, practices, and dynamics of oppression that are then perpetuated within the unjust structures of capitalist society. As his discussion unfolds, Freire makes it clear that liberation is neither a gift that can be bestowed upon others, nor is it solely an individual pursuit. Rather, he argues that liberation is the outcome of collective social struggle, which must be carried out through a coherent commitment to a political project in the interest of our humanity and the authentic democratization of the society. So what we see in chapter 1 then are these major themes that arise, and then they will move through the entire book. The first major one is this whole notion of humanization versus dehumanization. So humanization for Freire is our vocation. It's a phenomenon that's linked to our opportunities to be and exist as free historical subjects of our lives. He declares our humanity the inalienable right of all people. Here, Freire is asking us to move away from universal, fixed, or prescribed notions of life and our humanity, traits that are central to modernist logic, and instead adopt a multidimensional, relational, and concrete vision of our humanity, where the context dictates our approach, not a recipe. So dehumanization both domesticates and distorts our humanity, right? So this condition is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order. I mean, he comes back to that issue, understanding that things how they are not just because that's the way they are. There are structures and there are, economic and political and material conditions that have to do with why things are as they are. Here he posits, however, that the very experience of dehumanization is often what actually ends up leading the oppressed to struggle, because they get to this point where they realize that something is terribly wrong and that they are the only ones that will be able to struggle for their own liberation. Freire affirms that the historical task of the oppressed is not solely about our liberation, but also the liberation of the oppressors as well. He got a lot of pushback on this, but what Freire signals here is the dialectical relationship between oppressed and oppressor. Hence, the oppressed cannot truly be liberated without the oppressors being liberated in the process. Neither exists without the other. What he's trying to make here clear is that this notion of oppressor is part of an ideological binary conceptualization that has to be undone, that's part of our political task, our political work, to undo this binary. Freire does not essentialize either pole of the dialectical relationship between humanization and dehumanization, in that he argues that both are possibilities in the context of history and our human unfinishedness. It is because of this unfinishedness that transformation is possible. As such, oppression then must be seen as a limiting situation, not as a closed condition. And that's I mean, for me, one of the most important pieces is to understand that the notion of unfinishedness, it has such deep political resonance in that it reminds us that nothing is finished, that in fact, our participation, the way that we engage, the way we move forward together can make a huge difference in the world. He makes distinctions between this notion of true generosity and false generosity in the book. False generosity exploits the weakness of the oppressed. In order to continue to express their generosity, those in power must perpetuate injustice as well, so that they can continue showing how generous they are. True generosity consists of fighting for the restoration of our humanity, which requires we dismantle false charity, used by the powerful to constrain the fearful from working to transform the world. False generosity camouflages inequality and subdues the fear of freedom, while true generosity nurtures a sense of self-determination and democratic participation in our learning and communities. He also notes that false generosity is also present in those who join the oppressed in their struggle. Although they truly desire to transform the unjust order, they do not trust the people's ability to think, to want, to know. So often when people from a more affluent class decide to become revolutionaries, they come into communities, but then they come in without any real sense of faith in the people, and instead see themselves as holding the answer for liberation. The issue of or fear of freedom is also a theme in this particular chapter. Here, fear of freedom constitutes a relationship between oppressed and oppressor that is prescribed and becomes embedded. So freedom requires ejecting this image of the oppressor and replacing it with autonomy and responsibility, which is acquired through struggle, not by a gift. We can't give somebody with freedom. Freedom is something that each of us must be willing to struggle for together, individually and collectively. Freedom is the indispensable condition for the quest for human completion, in that without freedom, we cannot live authentically. Here he begins his introduction of love. And in this chapter, he argues that the struggle for our liberation constitutes an act of love, that why we struggle is because of love, and introduces the notion of an armed love, where there is a commitment and determination to fight for our liberation. The central problem that he engages here is this dismantling of the oppressor-oppressed relationship. So how can the oppressed, as divided and authentic beings because of the conditions of oppression, participate in developing the pedagogy of their liberation? So we must overcome the internalized duality of the oppressor contradiction. Although the struggle for liberation is a childbirth, he said, a painful one, the solution for overcoming the contradiction lies in the process of sustained dialogical collective labor that reveals our disempowerment while mobilizing transformative action in the world. Here, Freire introduces the oppressor-oppressed dialectic, which counters the dichotomous split and instead argues that both are locked in a dialectic that dehumanizes both sides, and thus one cannot exist without the other. Central to this idea is the notion that the oppressed often are conditioned into accepting the powerful as their ideal, while simultaneously the powerful have the power to define the oppressed. This contradiction is what later he calls the tragic dilemma of the oppressed, in that the oppressed begin to define themselves from the outside rather than who they are in truth. Solidarity connotes engagement with others, and this is an important aspect of Freire's work, solidarity, that this engagement with others as subjects, not objects of our own lives, breaks the abstraction and objectification that's built into the way the oppressed are perceived by those in power. Freire begins to introduce this notion of revolutionary praxis in chapter 1, or the dialogical praxis. So here our domestication can be transformed by means of our praxis, a regenerating process of reflection, of dialogue, of transformative action. This entails in breaking that duality. One cannot conceive of objectivity without subjectivity. This is a constant dialectical relationship that must remain in place. The world and humans do not exist apart from one another. They exist in constant interaction. In the struggle for liberation, then, we must confront reality critically and act upon that reality. What makes struggle possible is the process of conscientization, becoming aware of one's own oppression and that of others, which is fostered by conditions of open dialogue and collaboration. This is a crucial first step towards liberation, according to Freire. So radical requirement of praxis is that the concrete situation that begets oppression is transformed. Paulo notes, however, that when a change in objective reality strengthens an individual's class interest, this will provoke false perceptions and resistance. Herein lies the struggle. So he lays out in the book 2 stages in the struggle for liberation. The first, or the initial stages, the major concern is unveiling that culture of silence, unveiling the conditions that create, or the structures that create the conditions, dealing with the concerns of the oppressed and working towards transformation of the concrete conditions. And then the second stage begins when the reality of oppression has been transformed. It is at the point of empowerment when it becomes a pedagogy of all people in the process of permanent liberation. And of course, if we look at those stages, we've not been able to reach the second stage, even within countries that have had revolutionary processes, because somehow the oppressive structure of power that had been so traditional so easily become reinscribed. In this chapter, Freire also engages the question of violence, and here he clearly distinguishes between a possessive violence perpetrated upon the oppressed that negates life, and those conscious or unconscious acts of rebellion by the oppressed meant to affirm the right to be by opposing the inhumanity of oppression. His view here is reminiscent of Fanon's view on violence in his work, where he very much states that it's a very different motivation, that violence, when people are struggling to overcome their oppression, is violence that comes from that place is very different than violence that comes from a place of trying to maintain, a power and control. These are generated from very different places and very different motivations. So, yes.
Antonia, we have a question in the chat from a friend, Eleni. Eleni Xila, I don't know if you want to ask the question, yourself. Right. Please go ahead. Yes. Open your microphone and ask the question. I don't have to be the mediator.
Okay. The basic question is what we mean when we say liberty of oppression. Okay, when Freire was writing about engagement in the way of get the main notion, what is democracy or what is oppression, all these try to communicate to his scholars. Today, how we can give to liberty another, definition of what is missing in our life, what is freedom.
First of all, I think that's the whole thing, that we're taught to think, especially as professors or as, that we're there to pass on knowledge, to give somebody the definition of it. What I could say from my experience with Freire and my own work is that it is how you define those notions, because that's what you're asking. That we think that there are these prescribed definitions, but how we define those are very living definitions in terms of what are the realities that we are experiencing. So it has a lot to do with how do we live them. So I would say, for example, in a classroom, how do you live this sense of democratic participation? How do you, because what we do with our students and how we engage them and how we structure the opportunities within a classroom for the evolution, for intellectual formation and the evolution of their own understanding, has so much to do with helping them begin to arrive to their own understanding of what it means to experience a sense of liberation. What does it mean? What's interesting to me is that usually the people that ask that question, and I hope this doesn't come out wrong, is that, I grew up in poverty until I was 25 years old. I know what poverty is. I know what oppression is. I know what it is not to have opportunities to be heard, to speak, to be able to struggle to bring my children up, to feed them. These are very concrete realities. They're not just these abstractions that we're putting out there. That's why, for me, what I want us to think about is how do we engage in living definitions of this question of liberation and oppression within every context that we find ourselves? Because it is through that kind of presence that we have the possibility of making change. So that's the best way that I could try to explain it right at this moment without getting into kind of a prescriptive place with it, Elena.
Okay, Antonia, we have two more questions, and I would like to have these two questions and then move to the next. Yes, thank you, Eleni, of course. I'm sorry. Thank you, Antonia, for saying thank you, Eleni, because I completely forgot. So Alkinos Nazis, another student from the Open University. Alkinos, there you.
So hello. Now we are talking about, the oppressed. I have a question about this term. In general, the issue of social class transcends diversity. Let's say in these exiled years, he seems to elaborate the question of oppression in class terms. He puts a lot of emphasis on mean of production, he refers to Mao, Marx, Lenin. He, often mentions the revolution. But after his return to Brazil, he puts more emphasis on diversity in general, and this recalls the current conflict, let's say, within critical pedagogy regarding the issue of grand narratives. So at the end of the day, for Freire, where does Freire, what's his position regard to this issue of postmodernism?
I think Freire, like a lot of folks, they got caught into the postmodern twist, what I call the postmodern twist. But I think that very quickly he began to unravel himself out as he began to engage the questions of neoliberalism. And if you look, for example, at Pedagogy of the City, he engages this question of neoliberalism and the impact of neoliberalism on schooling and on communities and in society. So what you see is his efforts at different moments to respond to issues that were coming up. So part of what you see, there was a moment where the identity politics begins to start pushing in interesting ways in the United States and in different parts of the world. And we still continue to see where identity politics, I consider at times very problematic, where we lose a sense of how these relationships of oppression are interrelated. So then what ends up happening, people begin creating these hierarchies of oppression in ways that I do not believe really help us to move forward, rather than to beginning to understand that what we need to do is within our particular context, whatever context we're working in, is to be able to engage the conditions and structures, relationships, practices, policies that are at work, and see, what are the consequences of those? Who does it, who does it lift and who does it oppress? Who does it silence? And how does it silence? So these are the critical questions that we're constantly being called to ask. And so if you just see Freire in this kind of, very staid, closed place, historically frozen, reified, you will not understand Freire. And he, in fact, was constantly pushing against that. He was offering his ideas in ways, and I will mention it as we move forward, but this sense of reinvention, why this, it wasn't about you taking his ideas and say, okay, I'm going to do it exactly the way Freire does. That's not, he wasn't offering that. He was offering his own philosophical thoughts that came from all these different traditions, and offering what he was able to offer during his time, things that he believed were absolutely essential to understanding education as a democratizing force or as a force of oppression, to understand our pedagogy as either a democratizing, humanizing experience, or a very oppressive, authoritarian, fascist experience for students.
Antonia, one last question for this session is coming from our colleague at the Open University, Professor Zacharias Pallios, who is a sociologist of education. And I also would like to say, before I give him the floor, that many colleagues from the Open University, members of the faculty, are actually attending. I'm not going to name them all, but because there are a lot of them. But there are many of them. I can see them here, Danai, Ira, many others. So Zacharias, it's your floor. Please be brief and ask the question.
As usually, Dr. Darder, it is a fascinating lecture of yours. And it very much relates to Paulo Freire and all this that some of us argued for many years. One could hardly disagree with your stances, and one could hardly disagree with your positions about solidarity and love and struggle, let me say. Still, I would like to, talking about pedagogy, I should like to refer to a micro-level problem. I always taught my students that they had to work in classrooms with those that remained silent. The ones who spoke were probably less, it wasn't necessary for them to boost up. However, the ones who were silent needed time and needed effort and needed actually taking time from the school, from the class, 35, 40 minutes, which would then lead to a very bad certification from the superiors. So we have a school teacher who knows and hopes and tries to introduce equality of opportunity in reality, but then he's going to be suppressed by his superiors. How can a school teacher fight this? Or we are talking about planting a tree that we will never see growing and producing fruits.
So I think I have a very different perspective about all of these things. I mean, first of all, I believe that that when you create conditions for students that make them feel respected, loved, appreciated, and they're given room to express themselves, that experience stays with them. They may not have the same experience as they go on to other teachers, but that experience of freedom will stay with them. And I have the belief, it's just that the relationship, the authentic, genuine relationship of praxis that we create with our students is lifelong. That that we tend to think of history as this very linear thing, and we see this, we see relationships in these very linear ways. But for me, it's a matter of understanding, what am I doing in the classroom? If I have 45 minutes, how am I structuring my classroom? What are the ways? Am I giving multiple modalities, multiple ways in which my students can express themselves, so they can find their own voice? So they can, I mean, you know, if there's no room for them, if there's no time or space given, they're not, you know, it's going to just be a one-way situation. So I'm not sure that I understand your question, but I'm hoping that I'm able to express to you that your question is definitely a pedagogical question, but is a pedagogical question that asks us to be very self-vigilant about our own relationships and participations and the structures that we create within our classroom, within our spheres of influence, within all our relationships. And the problem is,
what if the school doesn't allow this?
I'm sorry?
What if the school system does not allow this?
Okay, the school system may not allow the structure that we want, but when you have those students in your classroom for 45 minutes, the school district is not in there now. It is you with those students. That's what I mean about stepping into a radical sense of responsibility about our lives and our capacity to transform, instead of seeing it grandiose, understanding that it begins within our absolute relationships, the relationships that we are structuring and creating with one another, the relationships we're creating with our students. Somewhere that gets lost. And so then we use the excuse, because in order to have the kind of relationship that Freire introduces, that kind of authentic, genuine relationship, we have to be willing to be vulnerable. Often people are not willing to be vulnerable. We talk a lot, but when it comes to really being vulnerable with our students and letting them see us as human beings with all our faults and all our own issues and difficulties, engaging with them in a very real way around the subject matters that we're teaching, it changes the relationship, and it changes the very power of our teaching. For those 45 minutes, the school district is not in charge. In those 45 minutes, you are in charge. And we have to take that kind of, you know, if we don't take responsibility in that way, then there's a way in which we refuse to be accountable for our participation in revolutionary struggle. To me, people think of revolutionary struggle in these grandiose ways. I think of revolutionary struggle in every moment of my life. How I am with my children, how I am with my friends, how I am with students, how I am with colleagues, how I am with the person who at the market, you know, when I'm you know, engaging them. That's these divisions and these ways in which we have not seen pedagogy as a living pedagogy. And Paulo I saw him as a person who brought a living pedagogy to the table. And that's, if there's any aspect of the tradition that I'm attempting to continue to support and nourish, it is that, a living pedagogy that demands our presence, our authenticity, our coherence, rather than just pomposity and a whole lot of talk that doesn't, you know, that has no grounding, that is not grounded in life. Students know the difference. They know when a teacher has integrity. They can feel it. They know if you're being honest with them or you're not being honest with them. They know when you're posturing. So you know, it's so much easier, so much better to just be an example of a fully human being in our relationships with them as much as we can learn. And that means that we have to be willing to learn from them, right? So it's in those 45 minutes, I better learn. If I want students to learn with me, I better be learning as well. We don't think about that kind of dialectical relationship and understanding around learning because of the sense, the authoritarian notion of being a professor. So I believe that that's one of the aspects that we need to work much more on, and we do very little work around that. And yet it is central to our students' intellectual, emotional, and spiritual formation. And I use spiritual not in the religious sense.
Okay, so there is another hand raised, but it's up to you.
Can I continue?
Oh, you want to continue? Okay, continue with the chapter, and then we will go to the question.
And I'll stop. Okay, so let me just go to chapter 2.
Okay, so my colleague Nectaria Paleologu will have to wait a little bit. Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I think she's okay. Yes, she's a
she's
a nice person.
Thank you for your question, by the way, because the issue of praxis, pedagogy and praxis is often left over here, and the more abstract notions are what is, you know, what people get involved with. So I appreciate very much. Thank you. Okay, so let me go. So chapter 2 is where Freire actually lays out what he calls a pedagogy of the oppressed. This is where he begins to really, you know, kind of get to that. And he says, apart from inquiry, apart from the praxis, individuals cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, with the world, and with each other. So in chapter 2, Freire sets out to unveil the manner in which education functions as an instrument of alienation, motivating philosophical ideas that enliven his critical analysis come from the works of existentialists, Marxists, and critical theorists who engage questions of ideology, cultural hegemony, consciousness, and oppression in ways that look at the underlying structures of domination and liberation. So from the very beginning, Freire begins a discussion of the narrative character of an educational system rooted in perpetuation of a colonizing and capitalist worldview. He introduces a banking concept of education where knowledge is like a gift that you bestow by those who cannot themselves be knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. So those who see themselves as being knowledgeable are supposed to bestow onto those who know nothing. So Freire proposes this problem-posing pedagogy, where a clear commitment then to a revolutionary praxis and a coherent purpose for humanizing inquiry are unapologetically centered on reinventing education for the practice of freedom. So in banking education, you see him, in a sense, juxtaposing authoritarian pedagogy with an anti-dialogical pedagogy, juxtaposing it with a dialogical pedagogy. So Freire views banking education as serving the interests of oppression, as necrophilic in that it stifles the creative power of the oppressed. It produces knowledge that is lifeless and petrified, reified knowledge. Freire details how this fragmenting, objectifying, and mechanizing pedagogy inhibits students' creativity and imagination by reinforcing alienation, fatalism, and submersion in a colonizing worldview of domination that discourages critical thought and transformative action. He denounces the manner in which banking education presents reality as this motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable world to which humans must adapt themselves. The focus then is on changing the consciousness of the oppressed, not the situation which oppresses them. So this is what happens in banking education. They have to change the students. The overarching pedagogical expectation is that students memorize mechanically the narrated content, becoming receptacles to be filled by the teacher. So his central message is that the purpose of education should not be for indoctrinating students to adapt to the world of oppression, but rather it should be for the practice of freedom. So here he engages the teacher-student contradiction in the same way that he looked at the oppressed contradiction earlier. So teachers and students are considered to exist in these opposite poles, where students exist as these objects to be manipulated and coaxed by the teacher in order to facilitate the student's passive receptivity to whatever knowledge teachers or the state would deem worthy. To explain the power of this alienating dynamic, Freire engages Hegel's dialectic of slave-master, where the student must accept their ignorance as justifying the teacher's existence, but unlike the slave, they never discover that they too educate the teacher. Through the ethos of banking education, then the oppressor contradiction, and acted through this vertical or hierarchical nature of teacher-student relationship, the outcome is a system of educational attitudes and values that preserve and fortify the contradiction, mirroring the oppressive society as a whole. So in a sense, the way that we live in the classroom, if it's mirroring the outside society, it's preparing those students to reproduce that society. Problem-posing education then, as a revolutionary praxis, is Freire's response to this oppressive educational culture of the banking concept. It is an educational approach that's grounded on a dialogical praxis with the explicit intent of promoting liberatory educational projects aimed at not only the resolution of that oppressor-oppressed contradiction, but also nurturing a living praxis for establishment of a permanently free society. Problem-posing pedagogy entails a horizontal or liberatory approach that welcomes student participation as free thinkers and actors within their world with an eye towards the development toward critical thought. It is generated through this dialectical engagement of teachers and students, where teaching and learning are understood as inseparable to a revolutionary praxis that supports conscientization or conscientization, this communal process of evolving consciousness, and that this consciousness happens in community. Dialogue, then, in this chapter is resounding because it is the cornerstone of Freire's pedagogy. At the center of a problem-posing pedagogy is dialogue, which Freire considers indispensable of developing relationships of cooperation and collective action within schools and societies. Through dialogue, then, a problem-posing pedagogy creates then the conditions for new pedagogical relationships to emerge, where teachers are also students and students are also teachers. This liberatory dynamic ruptures the hierarchy and authoritarianism of banking, the banking educational method. Instead, it promotes then this solidarity between teachers and students as revolutionary partners in the act of teaching and learning. Through dialogical praxis, a problem-posing pedagogy creates the space, the place, and time for teachers and students to discover and rethink together the social and material contradictions that impact their world. Together, they work to reflect on and name their world, demythologizing the commonsensical notions that stifle their awareness, and to act in the interests of voice, participation, and solidarity, all which are vital to democratic life. So here, the sense of education in the practice of freedom is what a pedagogy of the oppressed is about. Education as a practice of freedom then refutes the notion that the world exists as a reality apart from people. He reminds us that the starting points of a humanizing education are found in the historical conditions which shape and are shaped by the lives of teachers, of students, and their communities. Freire affirms here the capacity of men and women to transcend the alienating condition of coloniality or dehumanization that shape our lives. He, of course, extends this work to the realm of revolutionary leadership. As he ends this chapter, in the revolutionary process, he says, the leaders cannot utilize the banking method as an interim measure justified on the grounds of expediency, with the intention of later behaving in a genuine revolutionary fashion. They must be revolutionary, that is to say, dialogical from the very onset.
We have Nectaria Paleologu, a colleague from the Open University, who is also the director of a master's degree in language learning for refugees and migrants. I think she has raised her hand. So, Nectaria.
Thank you very much, George. Antonia, we are delighted to have your participation today at Hellenic Open University. It's really an honor for us. I would like to say that at the program where I'm working as professor, we are using your textbook, Critical Pedagogy Reader, as a course book. So I would like you to know that. Your work is important for us and for our students. I'm very happy to see that one of our students, Alkinos, mentioned about diversity issues. That's why I think Paulo Freire is very, very modern if we take into consideration the diversity in multicultural, multilingual classrooms. I would like to say on 2 points, asking a question to you, saying also to you that I'm collaborating with Martha Mondero Suberg. We are together at the International Association. She was a student of Paulo Freire.
I know Martha.
The question is about who gives voice, or if I can rephrase that, who empowers migrants when we're talking about these issues in action research or in the field, and which are the challenges and solutions. You mentioned that Paulo Freire concepts of dialogue, conscientization,
right?
Yes, this is a difficult word. Conscientization, yes. And action for change, underscored by his interpretation of voice, recognize that all the diverse or oppressed or marginalized people voices emerge out of the conditioned silence, let's call it like that.
Cultural silence, right.
Differential power dynamics. So do you think that this is easy for a new teacher who would like to find some kind of balance within the classroom to create the conditions? Is it difficult, or this is just politically oriented at micro level of the classroom and education? That's my question. Thank you.
I think what's interesting is that every time we talk about micro, people like to talk about them, what I don't want people to forget is that there is a dialectical relationship between micro and macro oppressions, but micro and macro, forms of injustice. They are absolutely connected. And so we can use them to understand that we're talking about more individual relationships or context, but we have to always remember that they're linked, right? I mean, it makes me, the other thing is, again, we don't give voice to immigrants, or we don't give empowerment to communities. Voice and empowerment is a process that evolves in particular relationships, and particular relationships of struggle, particular relationships of learning, of teaching and learning together. This whole notion, I hate to hear it, oh, I'm going to, people, a lot of bravado, I'm going to empower immigrants, or I'm going to empower, no, people don't need to be empowered. People need, empowerment is a process that has an interior, exterior dialectical relationship, and it has to happen within conditions that actually allow space and time for people to speak, right? To engage. And what you begin to see, I mean, if you've been working with, immigrant families or immigrant communities, that as people are given more, they're given opportunities, spaces are created, people begin, at first, they may be reticent, right? Because they maybe have not experienced many opportunities where their voices were engaged with respect or any dignity. But when you create those conditions, then suddenly what you begin, and you want to learn and you want to hear, then the conditions themselves allow for that, the empowerment, that process of empowerment to happen. And it's a very relational process. The issue of voice is a very relational process, right? So part of our work is, if from the standpoint of working in communities, is thinking, well, what are the conditions that don't allow people room or space to speak their own reality, to speak about what is happening, and how can we create those conditions? That we can do, right? Because we can use our influence with whatever power influence that we have, whatever programmatic resources that we may have, to create those conditions. But if we look at it that way, then we realize that it's a matter that the empowerment of communities that we're working with, their empowerment is completely tied and connected with our own empowerment, right? That it's a process that we are engaging together in different moments and in different ways. And that, so it requires a kind of shift, so that voice or empowerment is not a thing. It's not a product, it's not a thing that can be given, or it is a living phenomenon, a social living phenomenon that we enter with. And so many of the questions that are important is, how do we enter? How do we enter into those relationships? How do we enter into relationships with immigrant families who are struggling, so that we create the conditions where they feel a sense of respect and dignity for their lives. And they sense that we are partners, revolutionary partners is the term, with them in the process.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. They're in the same line with what I was thinking about, how we, let's say, give a context to the idea of giving voice. That should be a little different, how you described that already. Thank you so much. I'm going to write at the text, at the chat, also the paper that refers to Martha's work in line with your ideas. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Thank you, Nectaria. And let's move to chapter 3 to see about dialogue. Right?
Okay, so chapter 3, I call what I saw was Freire's effort to provide a methodology of the oppressed, right? And so his quote that so much speaks to me is that through their continuing praxis, men and women simultaneously create history and become historical social beings. And we do this together. In chapter 3, Freire continues then to deepen his articulation of a revolutionary praxis through engaging dialogue as an essential theme through the practice of freedom. In addition to his concept of the word and naming the world, he focuses on questions of methodology of the oppressed that emerged directly from his literacy work in the field. Here again, Freire connects the significance of the themes discussed earlier to the praxis of revolutionary leaders. So Freire's his notion that that dialogue happens with the people, it serves to disrupt the culture of silence. It perpetuates then, that's perpetuated through structures of social alienation and material oppression, right? We know that that's what perpetuates the culture of silence. And so dialogue, it's that the aim and purpose of dialogue is to disrupt that culture of silence. So he offers indispensable qualities of critical dialogue that pave the way for horizontal relationships that then can nurture and sustain the indivisibility of solidarity that's required to participate collectively in transformative praxis. In this chapter, then, he takes us outside of the classroom and into a thematic universe of critical inquiry, where the values of problem-posing pedagogy are integrated into a methodology of the oppressed that gives voice to concrete concerns and issues of alienation that obstruct our liberation and offers a participatory approach for investigation with and of the oppressed. So this whole notion of the word and naming the world really comes forth in this particular chapter. He says to exist humanly is to name the world, to change it. And so when we talk about the processes of empowerment or processes of voice, they are processes that he considers to be part of our humanity. And that part of how we do that then is through naming our own world, to name the world. So the word is the means by which we name the world. And it is the essence of dialogue. For through the authentic word, we participate in reflection and action as community. He does speak about the inauthentic word as they're causing a dichotomy that's imposed. The word is deprived of its dimension of action, and the word then becomes verbalism, if you recall, for those who have read Freire. Then he also speaks about action without the word, for action's sake, which then becomes a kind of activism that's devoid of reflection and critical engagement. In this sense, he believes that both verbalism and activism without the relationship there make dialogue impossible. In other words, we need both of those elements. They're central to a true dialogue or a true dialogical process. So dialogue is the encounter between people mediated by the world. It cannot occur between those who seek control by not naming the world as it is, but rather as they would prescribe it to be. So features of dialogue require he saw dialogue as an existential necessity of human beings, as an act of creation that can only exist in the presence of love. And to establish genuine dialogue, then Freire contends that educators must transform those vertical relationships that are rooted in authoritarianism. This entails dismantling the colonizing ethos of domination by establishing conditions for horizontal engagement within schools and communities, within teachers and students. Relational aspects indispensable to horizontal relationships then include humility, faith, trust, hope, and in this indivisible solidarity, which encompasses a pedagogy of love. So this sense of entering into the relationship with humility, having trust in others and in ourselves, the sense of faith in what people can accomplish, a sense of hope and this indivisible solidarity. I mean, these are central. I know from my own experience with working with students that the immense capacity of bringing these indispensable qualities to the relationship it changes. It's a game changer, as they would say, to how we understand our work as educators. So love is viewed as foundational for Freire. In that dialogue entails an act of courage. It encompasses commitment in the interests of liberation. It supports horizontal relations of power. It generates acts of freedom. It's carried in communion with others. It's open-ended, it encompasses creative power to transform, and it cannot exist without radical hope that a new world is possible. Because why we struggle, why we work, why we engage, why we learn is in so many ways about the kind of world that we envision creating. Language is also a key component here, and as you know, in terms of literacy and Freire's work, writings. So all language, he would say, exists within a structure of thought and life experience. So teachers must come to understand the structural conditions in which the thought and language of students is framed. That is, we have to understand, for example, how racism, class formations, gender inequalities, issues of sexuality, you know, all of these elements, how, and positionalities, how they impact students' language, and how culture and power intersect through linguistic relations within the classroom. Freire offers 4 stages of thematic investigation as he looks at this question of a methodology of the oppressed. So Freire's thematic investigation or problem-posing approach is centered on gathering information in order to build up a picture or codify around real situations and real people. So the first stage in the work that he did was to, learning the people's perception of reality. Like, you couldn't even begin if you weren't able to enter with people and understand what was going on. So in the sense of the classroom with our students, do we make time to really understand the perceptions of our students? Stage 2 is this preparation of codifications for thematic analysis. And those codifications come out of the understanding of the perceptions of the people with whom we work, returning to the people through cultural circles. So they would come back and engage then in these cultural circles around what was learned. And to check, to see, am I understanding this correctly? And through all of that, then requiring to stage 4, which he called the systematic interdisciplinary study. And that's the reason he thought that was so important, is that often within modernist education, disciplines, become very focalized. And the reality, then knowledge gets constructed in these focalized ways. And seldom is there an integral way of engaging all the different elements that in fact impact how we understand the world. He, of course, brings forth the concept of generative themes, which is they're neither arbitrary invention nor hypothesis to be proved, but is at the heart of Freire's methodological approach. And these generative themes, they emerge from the life experiences that are verified through circumstances. Humans as both objects, subject, the sense of dialectical relationships that we all carry between ourselves as objects, subjects, of reflection and determinants of our lives. And these themes are always historical in nature. In other words, they change as the conditions, awareness, and circumstances change. And part of that is what brings forth this notion that Freire often came back to the question of reinvention. So how do we reinvent, these concepts in ways that make sense within our particular context, cultural context, realities, communities, etc. So how we become conscious beings then is through our capacity to exist in a dialectical relationship between the limit situations that oppress us and our own freedom to act. Limit situations here he defined as obstacles to our liberation, and they present these concrete historical instances as somehow given, the situation is given, somehow there's nothing we can do about it. It creates a climate of hopelessness, if not perceived as temporal, if not perceived as something temporary. And it implies that there exist those who are served by the limitations and those who are negated by them. From here, then he moves to this notion of limit acts. And in limit acts, these are actions that are directed at negating and overcoming rather than accepting passively the given context of those limit situations, to create a climate of hope. New limit situations then surface as old ones are engaged. This brings into our understanding acts that challenge the status quo rather than stimulating a continuation and a reproduction of the status quo. It engages as actors or subjects of one's life rather than being passive objects. And our humanization or empowerment is achieved through surmounting these limit situations that we experience in our lives. By seeing the problems as limit situations, then we see them as temporary human-made constructions. And as such, then we understand that if human beings made a problem, then human beings can change it. The themes of epoch come up here, and just very quickly, in the sense of representation of particular complex set of ideas that constitute the themes of an epoch, the interactions of themes, a thematic universe. And these are then considered historical. They're never isolated and never static. So, for example, we could think about, we just went through COVID, right? We could think that we could actually sit together and create themes related to that experience of COVID in different parts of the world and how they were, and we'd understand it within that historical era and that historical moment. He identifies contradictory positions. So he talks about, these contradictory positions, they mythologize conditions. They create a climate of irrationality and sectarianism. They're used they can be used by looking at the contradictions. We can use them to unveil reality. They require tasks that are limit acts that challenge and unmask the positions or the limit situations. And here he talks about untested feasibility that maintain the status quo. So we have to be willing to test situations that we think are just commonsensical, that's just the way they are. The themes of silence, then again, are recognized here, where people fail, don't have the opportunity to name their own reality, where they're not able to articulate their own themes of life, where there's a fear of retribution of those in power. And that takes us to the question that was asked about the school district. I mean, what happens is that teachers often abdicate any sense of accountability or responsibility within their classrooms because they have this fear of retribution because of what might happen in the larger system, without thinking that there may be ways that they can in fact use their classroom to unveil and to bring forth some different ways of being. The question of conscientizar or conscientization, critical forms of thinking about the world, decoding of conditions of oppression, critical perceptions of the concrete, understanding the abstract material dialectic, deepening an awareness of our conditions, and the emergence of full subjects of history capable of taking action to transform the conditions of oppression in our lives and communities. In other words, it's a sense of consciousness and dialogue. The dialogue and consciousness, there's a relationship there. And so dialogue is not just sitting around and talking. It comes with a purpose, and the purpose is around the evolution of our consciousness and our understanding of the world in order that we might transform it. So I'm going to stop there before I go to the end. I am throwing so much at you, and I'm so
you are actually.
I wish I could be with you and spend days just talking about this.
Well, we will invite you together with Pella Kaloyanaki. We said that we will do a joint event with the Open University, and we will have you in Greece for several days. But one question from me this time. I'm sorry.
Why not? We love you, Yorgos and Zacharias, and we love Antonia.
Okay.
Antonia, Yes.
Okay, so for the codification and decodification of reality, Paulo Freire, in his, at least in what we know, he used art, right?
Yes,
he used art to codify and then decodify reality.
Right.
My question is that a necessary precondition? Do we always have to use art, or we can use other means of codifying the reality?
Again, George, this is not a prescription.
I know, but I want to hear it from
what
you.
He did. He looked at the context, right? He looked at the context. He looked at what people did, what was their way of expressing, and the community, used different artistic expressions to communicate. So he saw those as a language, which is interesting. They were a language, and so if you start at a place where people themselves are producing a language of art, in this case art, then that art is an expression, they're at. And so that's what I would say was more important. The issue is starting where people are at, starting where their strengths are, rather than seeing them as deficits. I mean, for example, if you're working with immigrant communities, if you look at immigrant communities as somehow being, totally deficit and lack, and all you see is what they don't, you miss the incredible passion and courage that it takes for families, to move, to have to go to other places, often to be displaced against their own will, to bring their children to try to survive. I mean, those are all incredible strengths. And so the question is, are we willing to see those strengths and see how those strengths can inform the process of the work that we're doing with them? Because when we start there's a dignity and respect that I think we bring to the work.
Okay. Now we have, I would like to inform you, because I see some hands raised, but we have 20 minutes, and we also have to project a video, which is about 13 minutes. Yeah. So I guess I would like you to continue, and then I will ask my colleagues to wait for.
Well, I'm wondering if maybe because of the time, I mean, people, I can just say very quickly that instead of going, through it, that the fourth chapter really comes back to this question of revolutionary leadership. So here he's trying to get to those points. And, he unapologetically asserts the revolutionary nature of cultural action, squarely examines the differences between anti-dialogical and dialogical approaches. He argues, that anti-dialogical conditions, given their alienating purpose, serve as instruments of oppression, while a dialogical process is enacted through a pedagogical and political commitment to the liberation of the oppressed. He expounds on the characteristics of anti-dialogical action, which is an acts of pedagogy and a politics of conquest that divides and rules and manipulates. In direct contrast, he points instead to the characteristics of a dialogical leadership or action which enact radical cultural expressions of cooperation, of unity, of organization, and cultural synthesis. So in a variety of ways, this last chapter serves as a synthesis of the book, and it revisits and weaves together many of the central themes that were explored earlier in order to speak to authentic revolutionary leadership, whether it be within schools or communities. So Freire in particular draws on Gramscian ideas of both moral leadership and the formation of organic intellectuals to engage with the complexity of political authority, communal participation, that are both essential to a revolutionary praxis of cultural action. So that's I mean, there's a lot more, but maybe, because of time, and we don't have to show the video. If we want, we can just go ahead and do, the questions.
Okay.
I'm good either way.
First of all,
I will go wherever you take me.
Okay.
I will go with you.
Zacharias and Alkinos have already said one question, so please keep your hands up. No, I will give you the floor. But first of all, we have one question from a colleague that she has written it in the chat. She's talking about how may we, I mean, if you have any idea, we don't look for recipes. Again, as you said, it's not a recipe. It's not do one step, second step, third step, fourth step. It's something beyond that formalistic idea of teaching. But how can we actually, let's say, work the pedagogy, make the pedagogy of love work in a distance learning environment like the one we have at the Open University? How do you feel about this? I mean, there is a distance and love. Yeah. I mean, I know there's love at a distance, but love usually requires full participation. You know what I'm saying? So what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question because, you know, one of the struggles for me is I'd rather be in a room with you, you know, with all of you. I'd rather us be able to engage each other and be able to be present. So it's a limit situation, right? If we use Paulo's, you know, we're dealing with a limit situation. But, you know, I hope that if nothing else, maybe a little bit, my own way of being with you, my own way of, you know, of being present fully to you. Like right in this moment, nothing else is important to me but to be with you this moment in the best way that I can, and to listen, you know, to listen and try to really hear what you're telling me, and trying to respond as best I can, as sincere as I can, understanding that I may not always, you know, that many times I may miss the mark, and because of the, you know, because of this method, right, it makes it harder for us to be able to engage more spontaneously. So I think, but at the same time, I believe that the intentions with which we go into things and the spirit that we bring to our conversations and to our presence has incredible power. And so if that's what we have, we understand it as a limit situation, and we try to work with it. I think when you're teaching, one of the really important things, you know, in terms of virtually, is doing what can be done to create chat rooms. You know, there's ways to use the technology where you can actually, I mean, you can bring 2 or 3, you know, students, put them all in these different ways so they can speak with each other. So if I'm teaching virtually, I'm always going to have that as one of the main places so they can have a conversation with each other in you know, with only 2 or 3 people, and then come back together with a full group. And then what I find is we have really wonderful conversations, but so much of it is, again, you know, how present are we able to be? And so I think if you're teaching virtually, if there was ever a situation where you need to be really clear and self-vigilant, you know, that we need to be clear and self-vigilant about ourselves, how we are, how we come to the table, how do we prepare to be with the students in that, you know, given the limitations. I don't like the virtual. I'm going to be honest, I'm very old school. Yeah. I'm going to be 72 years old, and I like being with people. You know, I want to be able to hug somebody, you know, and kiss them, you know. So this is very, very difficult. But at the same time, I'm not going to let that limitation keep me from trying to bring the best of myself to you, what I can offer, you know, and to be with you and to listen to you and respect you and you know, and really have respect the fact that, you know, you've come here to be together for this moment. I mean, there's a sense of appreciation that we do the work. So if that's the, you know, if we have to work this way, then we, you know, we work with this way. And that's what I would say in terms of, you know, and listening to the students, getting ideas from them, you know, about what would make it better for them. Because different students might have different ideas that I can't even think about. I'm always shocked how students, you know, they just open me up to think differently and actually make my classes better when I've been teaching.
Okay, so we have again Alkinos. Yeah.
So it's a two-part question, because in the pedagogy of the oppressed, we are talking about a specific context, but there seem to have been some challenges when the revolutionary or radical left comes to power.
Yes.
While, for example, the approach in Chile was tremendously successful, in Guinea-Bissau it failed.
Yes.
And there were disagreements with some Clark Ablar about the language and all this. And even then in Sao Paulo, Freire's work as a member of Workers' Party was quickly stopped. So I'm thinking, if there is something that inherently makes it more difficult to maintain liberation pedagogy in such a formal system, and on the other hand, within a capitalist formal education system of political and social reproduction, apart from internal tremors and contradiction, what possibilities are there for a systematic critical approach?
I hope that everything that I've talked about today helps to answer that last question, because all of these issues come out of years, 40 years.
How it's possible to use, let's say, critical dialogue and all these codification things if you have such huge barriers from the system itself? Of course, you can find some small openings, some contradictions, some tremors inside the system, and you can build on that.
You can't do it without social movement. I mean, if you're talking about a larger, massive, this is the question of social movement is absolutely imperative. I mean, it has to be a communal process of change. It's not going to be just individual. However, we must understand that the larger social movement must be linked to the spheres of influence and movement that we're involved with. They have to connect and be part of it. So I think that we first and foremost understand that the process of transformative change or a liberation pedagogy is not an individual, project. It's not something about, it's not to make a career. It's not about how you're going to elevate yourself. And this is one of the biggest problems we're dealing with. I mean, what you're pointing to is the damn contradictions that exist in an authoritarian system, especially today, how universities are structured and how the economic is the bottom line, and all of the ways in which it attempts to correct capitalism. And part of what we're dealing with is the corrective elements of capitalism that is collapsing. And so, of course, at the point of collapse, what you're going to see is an attempt to hold on tighter to the structures that perpetuate a particular way of life. So to think that we're not going to have issues, to think that questions of power are going to suddenly be off the table, I am not saying that. And I hope that in no way you're reading that. On the contrary, I'm saying that the issue of power, as long as human beings exist, the issue of power is always at work. The question is, can we find together a way to engage these questions of culture and power that are liberating rather than that are authoritarian, fascist, and that create, a context of deep injustice and inequality, not only in our own context, but around the world, right? So I think at times that without realizing, we have been domesticated in our own, we may have many degrees and have read all of these, but often our own minds are domesticated to think of how we think about the solutions or even the questions we ask. We don't realize how the questions that we ask are ingrained or embedded in an epistemology of war, an epistemology of debate, an epistemology that is about anything but transformation. It is completely about maintaining a particular system. So what people never engage, for example, is the dialogical approach that Freire brings is absolutely different to debate. It is not debate. Debate comes out of a modernist epistemology of the West, where there always is a winner and a loser. There is really not a whole lot of interest of what the other person is saying. It's really about winning. The university is set up that way. So rather, one of the frustrating things for me is that colleagues, for example, rather than being comrades, supposedly we're on the left. Let's just use that, right? We don't even know how to be comrades. We don't know how to be comrades. We write this stuff, but how comradely are we really? How many times are we competing with our colleagues rather than creating conditions where in fact we're working as a true community of struggle, as revolutionary partners together? Let's be honest about that, because what I see around the world is competition. People are embedded in that epistemology of war. It is an epistemology of war. So the issue of consciousness is central to this work. And the question is, are we willing to give up the privileges that epistemology of conquest and war gives us, whether it's patriarchy, whether, it's, our so-called race, our ethnicity, our class, whatever, our sexuality, whatever. And often, we would say, oh, yes, yes, yes. But when we say here, the rubber hits the road, when it's time to really make the change, people often hold back. And that's what we see in universities. So they will only go so far. Like they'll have a program of social justice in education or something. I know because I taught in that program. And I mean, I was fighting half of the time to get a real program of social justice in education, because it was like, oh, they love, saying it, that they have it, but in terms of actually living it and creating an intellectual, political formation, pedagogical formation with students that was truly about social justice and education, that wasn't really happening. Dude, I don't know if I may not be answering exactly the way you would want me to answer, but I hope that you're getting the spirit. I'm trying to answer something that's deeper in your own angst about how difficult this work is. And because this is difficult work, let's not pretend, right? This is difficult work to stay with this, to really stay with this and not to fall complicit with those structures and those practices that in fact perpetuate the very conditions that we say we want to transform.
Okay. Athanasios Strantzalos is also...
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah, Alkino. Thank you, Alkino. Mr. Strantzalos, we are ready for you.
Okay, I'm also opening the video. As a teacher from a non-typical public school in Greece, the School of Second Chance in Agia Anargyroi, the problems I meet when dealing with critical education of adults, in the spirit of Paulo Freire, is the problem how to acknowledge the context. You see, Paulo Freire comes all the time, again and again, to the fact that pupils, students, whatever you want to make them, companions in the speaking groups were in the same social status. But in our schools, I'm working in a school, in an Athenian school, we have several types of people coming in the school. And they expect to be educated in things like mathematics, which I teach, And the question is how to arise the interest if you don't know where they come from. They are not coming from the same field of work, of interest. And I read and I reread Paulo Freire, and his people around him were coming from the same field, almost. I mean, when he worked with rural people outside of cities. And my problem is, should we become formalists? Should we say that there's a social context to which we create our questions and we ignore the anthropological one? Thank you.
I think when I hear your question, the first thing that comes forth is that he was working with people of very modest means, but they were human beings. And one of the interesting things is that we don't admit it, people don't admit this, but often they believe that people that don't have money or who are poor, who live in poverty, are somehow different than the people who are rich. And there are the differences that exist, partly structural and partly in terms of economic opportunities. And so I want first to remember the project as a human process, that human beings, it's like often I have this sense that people believe them, they say they're humble and all of this stuff, but often when they deal with people who come from a different class or different conditions, they act as if their humanity is somehow more sophisticated than the humanity of others who do not. And I think that was the thing about Paulo that was so amazing, is that he could go into different contexts and he was always Paulo. This genuine interacting present human being. And that's the real challenge for us, is so that's the piece that we play as pedagogues. But the other piece is that if you read Paulo carefully in terms of the different, not just Pedagogy of the Press, but other books, the issue of context is absolutely essential. He comes back to this question of context. Context, the cultural context of the people, the linguistic context of the people are absolutely essential. So if we're going to teach within a particular context, we've got to understand what informs the life, what the contextual realities that inform the lives of students, or that inform the lives of people that we're working with in community. And the only way we get to know that, this is the real clincher for me, is the only way we get to know that is by willing to be with people. How do you know the context of somebody if you're not willing to be with them? And it is a process that it doesn't happen immediately. That's why it's so frustrating to me in the United States. I don't know if you have this kind of situation, but they would teach cultural competency, and then they would say, okay, if you're in a Black community, Black people do this, and Black, and Latinos do this. And I mean, it was just like you had like this recipe for, and coming out of, a Spanish-speaking, Puerto Rican community, I'd be like, what the heck is this? But that people would eat it up because it was prescription, and then they believe like, okay, now I understand. There is absolutely no way to understand a context or to understand a people unless we are willing to engage with them directly and be with them. So this is the challenge for us. This is what makes this work harder. Authoritarian pedagogy doesn't require you to know, in fact, doesn't want to know the people, because it doesn't believe that the students have anything to offer, doesn't believe, it's a very different pedagogy. And it requires a very different way of approaching and entering the work. And I think that that's the challenge for us. But absolutely, the context is essential. And it is through the context, the process of reinvention, how reinvention can, it emerges is through the very context in which we're working. That should be the place from which the reinvention emerges, from the very realities that people are engaging in and that are real for them in terms of their own lives.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that answered, but thank you for that.
That's great. I mean, I think the question was excellent. It's absolutely real, because we have a lot of people here with us today working for schools of second chance that actually deal with people that had the opportunity in their past to participate in education. And this is a very interesting.
But what we have to understand, George, if I can interrupt you, but we have to understand that even if they haven't, human beings are always learning.
Yes.
Always learning,
Yes.
And so it reminds me, I just tell you just a quick story. I remember I was doing, this cultural work in schools, and I was with a group of teachers. And I remember this young white teacher who had no experience in a Spanish-speaking community, but she wanted to become a bilingual teacher. That's why she was there. And so she said to me, oh, I feel so sorry for my students because, the Spanish-speaking students, they don't know anything. And I said, well, what grade are you teaching? And so she said, I'm teaching kindergarten. And I just said, well, I just want to ask you, do you think that anyone could become 5 years old, could grow to be 5 years old and not know anything? So what do you mean that they don't know? And then she goes, well, they don't know their ABCs in English.
Yeah, but they know it in Spanish. Yes.
But they knew it in Spanish, and of course they have knowledge, So
Yes.
the challenge again for us is to honor that, to honor and to open ourselves to learn about the knowledge that they hold, so that we together can create a learning context that is empowering, for those involved.
Okay, we have already passed our time, but we have 2 more questions that I would like to take, and then we will close this wonderful discussion. And
Okay.
I promise that I will upload, if you allow me, I will
Yes.
upload the video on
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So people can actually see it. So first of all, Vasilis Valmas, a former student of mine, and the last will be Zacharias Palios, who is also the director of our laboratory. So he will close, let's say, the discussion. So, Vasily, it's up to you.
Hello, thank you so much, Dr. Koulaouzidis. Hello, Professor Darder. I'm a career coach. In the past, I was a French language teacher. I have studied in Greece, Belgium, and France. In 2012, I chose to immigrate to the UK because of the Greek financial crisis. For personal reasons, I came back to Greece in 2016. During the last years, there has been a discussion about brain drain and brain regain.
Oh, yeah.
In my opinion, mostly young people feel directly or indirectly mentally oppressed, either in Greece or in Europe. So the question is, what is your understanding about this social phenomenon, and how could Freire's point of view could help individuals to deal with social oppression and deal with the obliged change, their adaptability and their employability in order to avoid depression? Thank you.
Yeah. I think that people become depressed when they feel a sense of powerlessness, when they feel that they're not meeting their own expectations or the expectations that other people have of them. So at least that's been my experience with young people. So I just want to make that note. I think that one of the most frustrating things for me is that it is part of colonization, the belief that you're going to find a better life in England, or that you're going to find a better life in the United States. First of all, the question is, what are you defining as a better life? Because I can tell you, the life we have in the United States is ridiculous in terms of, and I've lived in England, and when I've gone to Crete, for example, if Bella's still here, I saw a very different way of life. Yes, maybe it wasn't as extravagant, there weren't as, but I saw a richer sense of life. And I think that what's unfortunate is that epistemology of war and the epistemology of conquest is also at work in the sense of knowledge, of I have to go there so that I can become, it's about competition, so that I can become more worthy, more valuable. So, rather than a belief that what is needed can be found right where one is at. There's a sense that that's not possible. Like somebody cannot find, an incredible way of life and understanding and have so much to contribute in their own, wherever they're from, whether they're from India or they're from, and I know because I've had students from India and we've had these conversations of what they felt they had to leave in order to be able to somehow be seen as more valuable in order to get a job. So then we get to the situation of the job and the tyranny of the labor market, the tyranny of the labor market, which is absolutely linked to capitalism. And the tyranny of the labor market is that it works in the interest of the ruling class. So we want to say, oh, that's too old. No, we have a ruling class. Like, let's not pretend. And how can you have 8 men own this much wealth of the world and pretend that we don't have a ruling class, and that part of the process that goes on are the tensions, so that system that perpetuates the wealth and power of those few can stay in place. And that any time that people begin to fight against that structure, right, moving for change, they're going to be, subjected to oppression. We're involved in a class struggle, whether people want to believe it or not. Whether we want to pretend and use other fancy words or other theories. I mean, you can use all you want, but the reality is that wherever I have gone around the world, I keep seeing this same phenomenon over and over and over again. So the question is, how do we begin to bring, if I'm a professor, for example, in Greece, how do I create a different understanding of knowledge? How do I create a different understanding of contribution to society? How do I create, how do I engage with a different vision of what it means to have a good life, to create a good life? How do I begin to do that so that my students don't feel that everywhere else is better than where they're at? How do we have conversations about what is a rich life versus a wealthy life? I'm not wealthy, but I have a rich life.
Yes.
I have children and grandchildren. I have comrades all over the world. I have people that I love and that love me. And I do work that touches my heart.
Now you have more people that love you. Okay.
But what I'm saying, I'm going to come back to consciousness.
Yes.
So your question for me is, how do we transform the consciousness of what we understand to be legitimate knowledge, important work, important contribution for our communities and for our country, our different countries that we live in. And I see this, when I was in South Africa, this question came up. The question you're asking came up often, because there's a sense that, if they go to the UK, they're going to be seen. And then what's so interesting is, of course, when you get, maybe part of what's happening for me is that when you get to be 70 years old, what happens is that you start to realize those are all lies. There's all these deceptions and all these ways of thinking that are about keeping us participating in a system that actually oppresses us and that robs us of our humanity. So, anyway, I'll stop there.
Zacharias, the last question.
Dr. Darder, does this system that you refer to relates to gender inequality? And how would Paulo Freire feel about this, or you for that matter?
Gender inequality?
Yes, that's what he said.
Oh,
Gender.
hell, patriarchy is a major issue that we're dealing with. And if you're involved in this work, somewhere you must be having conversations with incredibly brilliant, intelligent women who are pushing back at you and trying to get you, to understand that what it means to have an equal relationship with a woman, and how our conditioning, impacts and makes it difficult for that to happen, and how we need to do it consciously, right? So we're looking at all the different ways in which oppression intersects, right? These intersections of oppression happen in our lives. And we begin to see that it's always about, exclusion. It's always about division, compartmentalizing, and hierarchizing life. And so for me, so much of the work is, how do we live in a very different way? Again, I'm going to come back to consciousness. You're probably going to be so tired of me saying, but this issue of consciousness is central, because I want to really reinforce that what helped me so much in my work is when I realized that consciousness and matter, there's a relationship between matter and consciousness. There's a relationship between consciousness and material conditions. In other words, all the material conditions that exist are tied to particular ideologies and ways of thinking. Otherwise, they would not be there. The institutions we work in. And you know that if you're in an institution and you've ever had to fight against, issues that were very oppressive within the institution, I mean, the structure is set up to protect itself. And so you realize that it is a matter of consciousness and the ideologies, the ways in which people are constructing what is considered to be legitimate ways of being and living and existing. And so we're asked in many ways in doing this work to engage with our own consciousness so that we can participate in the construction of a consciousness that's more in sync with the vision of the world that we truly want for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for the generations to come. Which, of course, hopefully this planet is going to survive.
Yes. Well, I think that, wow, we have all these comments in the chat, and thank you. But I would like, because we're coming to an end, everybody to open their microphones and applause for Antonia. Please open your microphones. It's important, and applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antonia, for being with us today. It was a great honor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
More than 2 hours. More than 2 hours.
Thank you.
More than 2 hours.
I'm tired.
Here.
Thank you, everyone. I hope to see you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I see your names. I see your hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We promised you that we will bring Antonia to Greece at some point in Greece, and and she will have the opportunity also to hug you, because she said that she wishes to hug you. So this is what we're going to do next. Okay, so thank you
for the
all.
beautiful messages.
I think it was a beautiful afternoon, evening, and we had, just for the records, we had from 100 to 130 people attending the event throughout those 2 hours and 20 minutes. So this is a very good number, I think. Let's not forget that this is a Thursday. It's a working day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I feel really honored. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonia. We will be in touch. And we'll post the video so that everybody can access it on the website of our laboratory. And I see all the comments. I don't know if you can see them.
Yes, I'm seeing them. I'm seeing them.
Okay, some are in Greece. Someone said that's a rare opportunity. Thank you again. And I have now to close the meeting for everyone. So once again, thank you all. And we will be in touch. Thank you very much.
George. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Σε ευχαριστούμε πάρα
πολύ. It was great. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Γιώργο, να είσαι καλά. Ευχαριστούμε.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Να είστε καλά κι εσείς. Να είστε καλά όλοι που ήρθατε. Να είστε καλά.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα παιδιά.
Okay, George, we will be in touch.
Okay, yes, you may, have a nice day in Los Angeles. Enjoy the.
Yes, I'm going to have breakfast now.
Yes, yeah, good. You should have breakfast and a big cup of coffee. Next time I will buy it for you, but this time I'm afraid you have to buy it with your own funds. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye.